Αν μπορεί να έχουμε λίγο ησυχία στο βάθος. Ευχαριστούμε. I'm Alexis Papahelas. I'm the executive editor of Kathimerini. I'm very glad to be back here at the Delphi Forum for, I don't know what time this is, but the forum is getting bigger and more important every year, and this is really good news. And I'm very happy today to do this Q&A with Ambassador Jens Plötner, who is the security and diplomatic advisor to Chancellor Scholz. A lot of you know him from his years as ambassador to Greece. It's good to have you with us. Let me start with the question whether Ukraine was a real epiphany for Germany in terms of foreign policy. And what kind of epiphany?
So the very short answer is yes, with an exclamation mark. And I would say this holds true for Germany. This holds true for Europe, for the EU as such. And I think it holds true for the whole world due to the geopolitical implications. So, but for Germany, I think, looking at all of us who are concerned, probably the way we had to adapt to this new situation was probably the longest.
If you can speak just a bit closer to the mic, sorry.
I'm too far from the mic? Okay. Was probably the longest way we needed to start adapting to the new situation. And I just take one big example. We had a very strict policy of not delivering arms into zones of conflict, having a very restrictive arms exports policy in general. And I think now we are probably behind our American friends, the second biggest provider of military equipment to Ukraine. And the government has just decided a multi-year plan to deliver over 10 billion euros worth of armament to Ukraine. That is something you would have told that a German politician 2 years ago, he would have called you crazy.
Now, is there an element of self-criticism in the sense that Germany was too dependent perhaps on Russian natural gas in the past, or was too soft towards Russia? What's your response to that? Because that is part of the criticism you hear these days.
Yeah. I think those are two different questions which need to be answered separately. Too dependent on Russian gas. I think it was about 40% of our gas came from Russia. With hindsight, it would have been better not to have it. But on the other hand, this was not a decision taken lightly. It was a policy which continued over several governments, which changing political colors. And the experience we had made was that the delivery from Russia was reliable even in times of acute crisis. So the impression was that we are not, doing any irresponsible bets. And I mean, even now, and this is only a footnote, but if you look at the chronology of events, it is the EU who decided not to stop importing Russian gas before the Russians turned off the gas tap. So even there, it was our deliberate political decision and not us being victim because of a Russian decision. Now, your second question, you asked whether we were too soft on Russia. I think it is unfair to say that Germany was too soft on Russia. I think collectively in the so-called West, in the political West, it's a fair question to ask. But then I think we need to remind ourselves that, for example, when Hillary Clinton came into office again, the Americans pursued a policy of reset with Russia. Up to the very end, there were strategic stability talks between the US and Russia. When President Biden assumed office, there was new impetus given to that. So I think there was a general policy which I still think was right of not cutting lines of communication with Russia and of trying to reason Russia into a more positive policy. We failed, but failure doesn't mean that it wasn't right to try.
Now, how different is German foreign policy under the current Chancellor and under the previous Chancellor?
I think traditionally in German foreign policy there is quite a big degree of continuity when it comes to foreign policy, and I would argue that this holds true also for the transition between Chancellor Merkel and Chancellor Scholz. I remind our audience that Scholz was member of the last government of Chancellor Merkel, so in part he was responsible for the overall policy. So I don't think the change in German foreign policy is that much due to the change in the coalition, but it is certainly due to events.
So you mean they do the un-Greek thing of calling each other and is she getting any advice from her?
So I don't want to go into that, but because this kind of communication is confidential, but Olaf Scholz is not a person who thinks that it is foolish to benefit from somebody else's experience.
Now, there's a lot of discussion these days in Europe about strategic autonomy and whether Europe has to develop its own defense and intelligence capability and so on. Now, how far are we from really building up this capability, not up to the US standards, but something that could be compared to the US?
If that is the benchmark, compared to the US, I think we are quite far. We need to be realistic. We are quite far. But that doesn't mean that we should stop working towards this goal. On the contrary, I think we need to push. During the Trump times, it was obvious to all of us that we need to make sure that we are able to rely more on our own strength. Now in the White House, and I mean, God bless, in this geopolitical situation, we have an American president who could not be more pro-European. So I think there is the temptation of sitting back and relaxing, but there is no reason to do so. And I think this pivotal moment in time, the Russian war against Ukraine, reminds us that one of the consequences is that we need to make sure that Europe becomes stronger and stands more firmly on its own feet. And so we need to work on that. I think the headline, most everybody can agree, but then when you get to the practical steps, it gets much more complicated. Take, for example, the issue of voting with qualified majority. If one country out of 27 can block everything, we are not going to get our act together in times of crisis. So this is just one example where we all agree on the headline. When we look at what it takes to actually move ahead, it becomes more complicated. We still need to do it.
Are there any milestones ahead in terms of joint arms procurement and so on?
I think it's an ongoing process. This crisis is awful, but as always, it's also a catalyst for moving ahead. So take the most recent decisions of joint procurement of ammunition to support Ukraine. This is something we have never done before. So you see that we are moving ahead. Also the fact that we, in the realm of our common security and foreign policy, that we are willing to deliver as EU lethal equipment, which for a long time was a total no-go. Now, horrible to say, and the reason is horrible, but it has happened a lot. And that also shows that we are moving ahead, but it's a continuous process.
Now, Ukraine, you've been involved in this for a long time. How do you see the situation right now on the ground, and what's the end game in all this?
So I think the situation on the ground is, if you look at it on a day-to-day basis, it's heartbreaking and it's difficult. I think we can all only stand together in admiration for this spirit of bravery and defense we see from the Ukrainians. People are dying daily, not only soldiers but also civilians, because of the indiscriminate attacks of the Russians. So that's the micro situation. But if we take a step back, I think the lesson is Russia has basically, it has shown it cannot win this war. It is unable to fulfill the war goals Putin set out. And that's a big success story. Mainly, we need to attribute that to the Ukrainians, but I think we all join forces to support them. And despite all the hardship at the moment, which is heartbreaking, I think that too, if we pause and look at the situation in a broader context, that is good news.
But can you foresee a deal where both parties will be unhappy, but willing to reconcile with some sort of deal, realistic deal?
At the moment, it's difficult to envisage. I think the saying that all wars end at the negotiation table is not automatically true. We have wars who end in a very precarious stalemate. Take the Korea War. It's a very precarious stalemate which has lasted now for many, many decades. But if we look at Korea, we see what the implications are for both sides. And that is why I think all of our policy should be directed in trying to avoid that, trying to come to a negotiated settlement. From all of our dealings with President Zelensky and his team, I see that the Ukrainians are willing to do that, but what is missing is the real will to negotiate from the Russian side.
How much money has Germany spent on this crisis, both in terms of weapons and refugee support and so on?
I think I don't have an aggregated figure, but I would say something roughly about 15 billion.
15?
15 billion.
Mm-hmm. And now, how long do you think German public opinion, European public opinion, will be able to support this kind of effort, this kind of expenditure and so on? Do you think there will be a Ukraine fatigue, in other words, at some point?
I have no indications for that. I think the way my boss went about this very difficult policy issue was always mindful of the fact that what we do as a government needs to be sustainable. And that is why he slowly built our support, making sure that Germany would not, run ahead and there wouldn't be any knee-jerk decisions, but that what Germany does was always embedded in a collective effort. Us taking the substantial part, which given our size and economic strength should be ours, but always together with partners. And one of the key motivations for this policy approach was that from his point of view, from the Chancellor's point of view, this was the best guarantee that it would garner the broadest possible support in Germany. And so today, roughly speaking, you have 70% which agree with the way we are going, and you have 15 who say we should do much less, and you have 15 who say we should do much more, so that we in government feel is a confirmation of the policy choices made.
Now, a lot of people feel like there's a new Cold War brewing at the moment between the US and the West and China. Do you think that's the case, and is there a danger for Europe to be squeezed between the two?
So my off-the-record answer would be, if only it were a Cold War. I think what we are possibly facing is something which is much more complicated. If the Cold War was a two-dimensional setup, I think now we have at least three-dimensional setup, because obviously we have China new in the game. But even that, I think, is not enough to explain the new reality, because I think this week India is surpassing China in population. Now, population doesn't automatically equate economic power, etc., but it shows you a tendency that for us it is almost impossible to imagine a power of the size and importance of India accepting a bi- or tripolar world. And then you have all the Gulf region, which is moving closer and which is also aspiring now to play a more prominent role. You have big countries like Indonesia who also will not want to be put into one of the camps. So the future is going to be multipolar, and I think that is in our interest, because that gives us the best chances of making sure that Europe is one of these poles.
Now, the problem the way I see it is that the US is trying to pull Europe on its side when dealing with China. But at the same time, it does things like providing incentives for European companies to invest in the US, ignoring European interests. How do you reconcile the two?
Yeah. I don't witness this trying to pull us over. I don't think they need to pull us over, because there are many areas where we agree with the US and where, being pluralistic democracies, we have the same approach. So when we have a critical view on questions of rule of law and human rights in China, it's natural that we agree. As market economies, when we see the not level playing field in our economic dealings with China, it's automatic that we agree. So I think there is an automatic proximity, but of course there are areas where we also disagree. And what you spoke about, the Inflation Reduction Act, is a problem. The good news is, I think our friends in the White House understand that it's a problem. And that is why it's good that at the moment we have the Commission in in-depth discussions with the American administration to make sure that Europe is not treated like any other country, but as the closest economic partner of the US we are.
I remember when the previous Chancellor visited Athens and I asked her what is her biggest nightmare. She said Trump being re-elected, because it would be the end of the West. If that was the case, would that really change the landscape and the relations between Europe and the US?
I think it would, but I think we in Europe need to free ourselves from these kind of scenarios in order to motivate ourselves. I think we should understand that regardless of who is in government in the US has a global role to play. And the more we in Europe are able to get our own act together, the more attractive we are as a partner for the US.
Now, you've been involved in Eastern Mediterranean affairs as well. How do you see things developing? We have an election in Greece and Turkey, as you know. People were very concerned about stability in the area. Do you see that being affected by the elections, and how do you see the day after as well? And your own role, I mean, the German role in this.
So first of all, I think it's a good news that so far, touch wood, despite the elections here and there, we have not seen an increase in stability, rather the contrary. I think we have seen that things have calmed down. Now, there may be other reasons to that, but the fact remains, and I think that's good news. Secondly, it is a kind of a happy coincidence, I find, that there is a synchronization of electoral calendars, not only in Greece and Turkey, but in a certain way also in Cyprus. So by the end of this year, in the second half, depending a bit on how things evolve here, with one elections or two, there will be a new government, a newly elected and mandated government in Turkey, in Greece, and in Cyprus. And I think that it is quite obvious that this is a good situation for a new positive push to bring more stability to this region, because the bottom line is, I mean, all stand to gain if there is a good understanding and stability in this region.
Okay, finally, since we're coming to the close of this, let me ask you what keeps you up at night in your position?
What keeps me up is, I think at the moment, mainly the war against Ukraine and the implications of that for our own national security, for what we need to do in Europe to live up to the challenges this poses, and how best to cope with the geopolitical fallout of this, because I feel that this war against Ukraine is something like you know, the eruption of a volcano, and very violent, dangerous. You have lava flowing all over the geopolitical system. Where will it flow? How long will it flow? Are we in danger? Can we shape what is happening? We should try and shape what is happening. That's what keeps me up.
And you think Europe is going to grow up geopolitically within our lifetime? Because I think we've been spoiled for a while.
Yes, to your second remark first, as always in Europe, I think you know, a former Indian foreign minister said in diplomacy there is never a full stop, it's only a comma. And I think the same holds true for the development of Europe. We will never reach the end state. It's an endless work, and at the moment it's our job to bring this forward. After others will take over. But I am convinced, at least that is true for my country, there is no alternative to this European Union, and we want it to become stronger and stronger.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks.